Do you ever feel like every day is the same as the last? Like you're reliving the same day over and over again? Well, Sean's life was nothing like that. He could only wish for some type of normalcy, but since leaving Ireland for America, nothing was normal. It was the end of January 1880. The wind cut through Sean O'Connor's coat like a blade, the Pennsylvania winter colder than anything he'd ever known back home. Snow lay thick on the ground, piled high against the squat wooden buildings of Punxsutawney, their roofs sagging under the weight of ice. The town should have been like any other, a quiet place where a man could start over. But something in the air felt wrong. The people who passed him on the street kept their heads low, shoulders hunched, as if expecting something to strike from the shadows. Sean had been in enough dangerous places to recognize fear when he saw it. At the tavern, a dimly lit place that stank of sweat and old wood, he warmed his hands by the fire, listening. The conversations were hushed, voices clipped and careful. It wasn't long before he caught the word they all seemed afraid to say too loud. The groundhog. It came in whispers, muttered under breath over tankards of ale. Sean leaned in as an old man, hunched and gaunt, warned the younger patrons, his voice raw with something like grief. "It doesn't matter what we do," the old man said, shaking his head. "Every year the same. We lay out our offerings, we say our prayers, and still, it takes what it wants. One by one we go missing, dug down into the earth, chewed up like wheat in a millstone." The others didn't argue. They only drank deeper. Sean scoffed, rolling his eyes. He grew up with stories of fairies and banshees, of beasts that haunted the hills and lured men to their deaths. The old legends were good for keeping children inside at night, but he was no child. Still, when he stepped back out into the cold, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The path to his lodging was long and dark, flanked by trees that groaned under the weight of ice. He walked with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his boots crunching through the frozen snow. Then, the earth moved. Not the wind-shifting snowdrifts, not the settling of ice in the trees. The ground moved. Sean froze. Beneath his feet, the packed snow trembled, a deep vibration humming up through his bones. Then came the sound, low, guttural, a scraping that set his teeth on edge. The ground erupted. A massive shape burst from the snow with a deafening roar. Clumps of earth and ice flew in all directions. The creature was enormous, its fur black and matted with dirt, its eyes reflecting the moonlight in a sickly yellow glow. A groundhog, but not like any he had ever seen. It was the size of a bear, its body thick and hunched, its mouth filled with jagged yellow teeth too large for its rodent skull. Clawed forepaws dug into the frozen earth, shoving aside mounds of dirt as it pulled itself free from its tunnel. Sean's breath caught in his throat. Then, it lunged. Instinct took over. He turned and ran, the air burning in his lungs as he sprinted for the trees. Behind him, the thing gave a guttural snarl and began the chase. He had seconds. Sean veered off the path, plunging into the woods. Branches lashed at his face, but he didn't slow down. His boots slid on the ice as he ran, his pulse hammering. The ground trembled again, closer this time. Then ahead, movement. A figure. Sean barely registered the boy's face, pale, framed by dark curls, before strong hands grabbed him by the coat and hauled him up into the trees. A branch cracked beneath them as they scrambled higher. Sean's breath came in sharp gasps as its claws raked the base of the tree, its gaping maw snapping inches from Sean's dangling boot. Sean pressed himself against the trunk, eyes locked on the beast below. Its breath came in thick, heavy clouds, the stench of decay rising from its fur. The boy beside him moved fast despite his slight frame, steadying Sean as they climbed higher. It wasn't until the groundhog let out a frustrated snarl and slunk back into the earth that Sean finally looked at his rescuer. The boy's grip on his wrist was firm. He had delicate features, his face flushed from exertion, but his brown eyes were sharp, calculating. Sean swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the press of their bodies, of the way their breath mingled in the freezing air. "Don't move," the boy whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. Sean didn't. He couldn't. Below them, the groundhog sniffed at the base of the tree, circling. Then slowly it sank back into the shadows it came from, disappearing into the blackness of night. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the boy finally exhaled and loosened his grip on Sean's wrist. "You're not from here." His voice was soft, but there was something knowing in his tone. Sean shook his head, his pulse still racing. "No," he admitted. The boy's eyes flickered down to the churned-up earth where the creature had been. Then he looked back at Sean. "You should leave." Sean saw fear before, in war, in the streets of Belfast, in the eyes of men who knew their death was near. But there was something different about the fear in Punxsutawney. It was quiet, the kind that settled in bones and refused to leave. The disappearances started the morning after his arrival. A stable hand went missing first. His boots were found outside the barn, one upright, the other on its side, half buried in churned-up snow. The doors to the stable were splintered open from below, the ground beneath the hay disturbed, as if something burrowed up from beneath it. The townspeople whispered, but no one dared say aloud what happened. By the third day, another was gone, a widow who lived alone at the edge of town. Her house stood dark, the front door torn from its hinges, a long furrow of disturbed earth trailing away from it. Sean heard the murmurs at the tavern, caught the way men gripped their tankards tighter, the way the women clutched their shawls close around their shoulders. Still, no one spoke of hunting the creature. No one spoke of stopping it. They simply gathered, like they did every year, and prepared their offerings. Sean found the boy who saved him in the churchyard that evening, splitting wood by the light of an oil lamp. His name was Fritz. His sleeves were rolled up, his breath visible in the freezing air. The muscles in his arms tensed as he brought the axe down, the crack of splintering wood punctuating the silence between them. Sean hesitated before stepping closer. "You swing that thing like you've got a grudge against the logs," he said. Fritz barely glanced at him. "Maybe I do." He set another log on the chopping block. Sean shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "They're not going to stop it, are they?" The axe paused mid-swing. Then Fritz exhaled sharply, driving the blade down with a force that sent chips of wood flying. "No," he said. Sean leaned against the nearest fence post, watching him. "You don't believe in all this, then? The offerings, the prayers?" Fritz shook his head. "It doesn't work. It never works." His voice was tight, raw. He wiped sweat from his brow, despite the cold, then turned to face Sean fully. "Every year we give more, we pray more, we beg more, and every year it takes more." His fingers curled into fists. "I told my father we need to fight it, to kill it. And do you know what he said?" Sean didn't answer. "He said I was lost." Fritz laughed, but there was no humor in it. His jaw clenched. "He said I was blind to God's will, that if I had faith, I would understand." He shook his head. "I don't want to understand. I want it dead." Sean studied him, the way his body was rigid with frustration, his breath quickening. He saw something in Fritz then, something wild, something desperate, something that was locked away for too long and was beginning to claw its way free. Fritz turned away first, running a hand through his dark curls. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "I shouldn't be telling you this," he admitted. "You're new here. You don't owe this place anything." Sean stepped forward, close enough that he could see the tremor in Fritz's fingers. "You helped me," he said. "I owe you." Fritz glanced up at him, his brown eyes catching the flickering lamplight. There was something else in them now, something that wasn't only fear or anger. Sean felt it too, the awareness of how close they were standing, the weight of the silence between them, the way their breaths mixed in the cold air. Fritz's gaze flickered to Sean's lips, then went away just as quickly. A warning bell rang from the church steeple, breaking the moment. Sean exhaled, stepping back. Fritz did the same, clearing his throat, gripping the axe like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Get inside, Sean," Fritz muttered, "before it gets dark." Sean hesitated, but then without another word, he turned and walked back into the cold. Behind him, the night stretched long and silent, the snow untouched except for the faint, unnatural tracks leading out of town. The woods were dead silent beneath the weight of the snow, save for the sound of Sean's and Fritz's boots crunching through the frozen ground. Their breath billowed in front of them in thick plumes as they pressed forward, their lantern casting a weak, flickering glow against the trunks of skeletal trees. Sean's instinct screamed that they shouldn't be out here. The town was quiet tonight, too quiet. No one lingered outside after sundown, and yet here they were, hunting the thing that hunted them all. Fritz led the way, his posture tense, his grip white-knuckled on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Tracks are fresh," he muttered, crouching to brush his fingers against an indentation in the snow. The clawed prints were deep, each one the size of a man's boot, leading toward the thickest part of the forest. Sean swallowed. "You sure about this?" Fritz shot him a look. "You scared?" Sean scoffed, but it wasn't convincing, not even to himself. "I'm not eager to get eaten, if that's what you mean." Fritz didn't answer. He straightened and took another step forward. And then the ground beneath them shifted. The first thing Sean felt was the vibration, deep and unnatural, like something massive was moving beneath them. Then came the sound, a low, guttural rumble, followed by the terrible, splintering crack of something tearing through the frozen ground. "Watch out!" Fritz's voice cut through the cold night. The ground behind them exploded in a shower of snow and dirt as the beast emerged. Sean only caught a glimpse of it, hulking, fur-covered, its grotesquely large teeth. Its eyes, dark and wet, burned with hunger. They bolted toward the tree line. The thing moved fast, too fast for something that size. Each time one of them turned around, it was closer than before. They didn't stand a chance. Sean tripped over an exposed root and hit the ground hard. Before he could scramble back up, Fritz grabbed him by the arm and yanked him toward a massive fallen tree. "Get under now!" Sean barely had time to think before Fritz shoved him into the hollowed-out space beneath the tree trunk. They collapsed into the tight space, pressing themselves as deep as they could go into the dark cavity. Then the groundhog was there. Sean held his breath as the monster prowled outside, its heavy breathing ragged and wet. The stench of decay filled their nostrils, thick and nauseating. The snow crunched beneath its massive claws as it circled them, sniffing, listening. Sean could feel Fritz trembling against him. Then, scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of claws raking against bark. Sean bit down on the inside of his cheek, clenching his fists, willing himself not to breathe too loudly. The creature was so close. He could hear the wet click of its teeth snapping together, smell the rot clinging to its matted fur. And then, Sean inhaled too sharply. The groundhog stopped. Its snuffling grew more frantic, its movements more erratic. Fritz reacted before Sean could, pressing a hand over his mouth, fingers trembling slightly against his skin. The warmth of it sent an immediate jolt through Sean's entire body. The moment stretched unbearably long. Fritz's face was inches from his, eyes wide, pupils blown. Sean was acutely aware of the weight of Fritz's body pressed against his own, the heat of him, the way his fingers tightened slightly against his lips. And then, with the certainty of someone who might not live to see another sunrise, Sean closed the gap. It was quick, desperate, brief. Just the press of lips, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them. A silent wish fulfillment before death. Then, the groundhog roared. The trunk above them splintered as claws tore into it. Fritz yanked Sean away just in time and they bolted from the hollow. The creature lunged, but Fritz fired his rifle into it, the deafening blast making it rear back long enough for them to run. Snow flew around them as they crashed through the woods, not stopping until the trees thinned, until the dim lights of town flickered in the distance. Only then did they collapse against each other, panting, hearts racing. Neither of them spoke of the kiss, but Sean felt it lingering on his lips. Even his fear still thrummed through his veins. The town gathered in the church, their faces drawn and pale in the dim candlelight. The pews were packed with weary bodies, the air thick with desperation and the acrid scent of burning tallow. Fear clung to them all like a sickness. Another disappearance. Another set of tracks in the snow leading to nowhere. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, but inside, the voices of the townspeople rose in angry, panicked discussion. "We must make the offering sooner," someone insisted. A bigger sacrifice, another added. Perhaps two this time. A murmur of uneasy agreement swept through the congregation. Sean stood toward the back of the room, arms crossed, jaw tight. He saw fear like this before, seen what it did to men, how it made them desperate, irrational. It was the same fear that drove him from his homeland, the same fear that burned through villages and left only ruin behind. At the front of the church, Fritz rose to his feet, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white with tension. "This is madness," he said, his voice ringing through the wooden beams. "You all know it. None of this is working." A hush fell over the crowd. The flickering candlelight cast jagged shadows over their faces as they turned toward him. Fritz took a breath and squared his shoulders. "You think you can keep feeding it and it will leave us alone? It won't. It never does. Every year we give it what it wants, and every year it comes back. We have to kill it. That is the only way this ends." Gas rippled through the room. A woman clutched her rosary. A man shook his head in horror. Fritz's father, Reverend Weber, rose slowly from his place at the altar. His eyes, dark and sorrowful, settled on his son. "My boy," he said quietly, a voice thick with grief, "do not speak such blasphemy." "It is not blasphemy if it's the truth." Fritz's voice wavered slightly, but he held his ground. The Reverend's face hardened. "You stand here, in the house of God, and disobey thy father, in defiance of the Lord's commandments." Fritz swallowed hard. Sean could see the war inside him, the pull of obedience, of faith, of the love he still bore for his family. But his hands shook with frustration, and when he spoke again, it was with conviction. "The Lord is not the one taking our blood." A stunned silence filled the church. Then came the outrage. Men stood shouting over one another, voices raw with anger and fear. "The child has been corrupted by that fair-haired boy. He will bring ruin upon us. His words will doom us all." Sean's fists clenched as the crowd turned against Fritz, their desperation twisting into something cruel. He pushed forward, shoving past startled townspeople until he reached Fritz's side. "That's enough," Sean growled, his accent sharp against the din of their rage. The Reverend looked at him, eyes narrowing. "This is your influence, isn't it?" Sean didn't flinch. "Fritz has his own mind." The Reverend's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Then may God have mercy on him." The words were final. The congregation stared at Fritz as though they no longer recognized him. He was no longer their Reverend's son, no longer a member of their town. He was an outcast. Fritz trembled beside Sean, but he did not look away from his father. When he finally turned, his face was pale, his jaw tight. He walked past the rows of staring eyes, his posture stiff with barely contained hurt. Sean followed. As the heavy church doors shut behind them, the cold night air hit them like a slap. The wind bit at their skin, carrying the weight of the town's condemnation. Fritz stopped a few steps outside, his breath shuddering as he exhaled. Sean hesitated, then reached for his hand. Fritz didn't pull away, but he didn't look back either. The town reached its breaking point. Sean could hear them gathering outside, their voices a low and angry murmur beneath the howling wind. Torchlight flickered against the frosted windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the wooden floor of the small cabin where he and Fritz took refuge. Fritz sat on the edge of the cot, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. His face was drawn, pale, his eyes dark with something between fear and resignation. "They mean to drag me back," he whispered, "to make me repent." Sean stood by the door, his fingers curled into fists. Let them try. They didn't take any chances, so they got fully dressed in boots, coats, and a few layers of clothes, and what few valuables they held were shoved into deep pockets. The first knock was not a knock at all, more a sharp resounding thud as a shoulder rammed into the door. "Friedrich Weber," a voice called. "Come out and face your judgment," Fritz flinched. Sean stepped forward. "Go to hell," Sean snarled through the door. A roar of outrage erupted outside. Someone threw a rock at the window, shattering the glass. The wind rushed in, bitter and sharp. Sean turned back to Fritz, grabbing his arm. "We have to go, now." Fritz hesitated only a moment before nodding. He snatched up his coat and followed Sean to the back door. But before they could open it, the front door burst inward with a splintering crack. The The townspeople surged inside, their faces contorted in fury. Leading them was the Reverend, his face carved from grief and something darker, something like fear. "Friedrich," his father said, voice low and raw, "this is your last chance. Come back to us. Do not throw away your soul." Fritz trembled. "My soul is not in danger." The Reverend's eyes glistened with sorrow. "No, my son, it is lost." A man lunged forward, grabbing Fritz by the arm. Sean moved on instinct. He drove his fist into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling back into the others. Then he stepped in front of Fritz, blocking him from their grasp. "You're all cowards," Sean spat, his voice echoing in the small room. "You've let your fear turn you into monsters. You think sacrificing your own will save you? You think chasing him out will bring you peace?" He shook his head, his voice dripping with disgust. "The groundhog is the beast, not him, but you're too damn scared to see the truth." Silence fell, and then, boom. The earth shuddered beneath them. A deep guttural growl rumbled through the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards. Sean barely had time to react before the wooden planks buckled beneath their feet. Screams erupted as the floor split open and a monstrous clawed paw burst through the wood, dragging one of the townspeople down in an instant. Blood sprayed against the walls. The groundhog had come. Panic overtook the mob. The townspeople turned and fled, their fury forgotten, replaced by sheer, primal terror. Sean grabbed Fritz's hand. "Run!" They tore through the back door, snow crunching underfoot as they sprinted into the darkened streets. Behind them, the town erupted in chaos, the beast tearing through buildings, its monstrous form rising from the earth, its jagged teeth glinting in the torchlight. Fritz stole one last glance over his shoulder. His father stood frozen in the doorway, watching him go, sorrow and regret carved into his face, but he did not call out. He did not stop him. Sean tightened his grip on Fritz's hand, pulling him forward. They had no choice but to keep running. The next morning was February 2nd, 1880. The sounds of distant revelry carried through the frozen air. The townspeople were celebrating, their cheers and hymns echoing through the hills. Lanterns glowed against the heavy grey sky, illuminating the town square where they would lay out their offerings, their desperate attempts to keep the beast at bay for another year. Sean and Fritz were far from it now, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they trudged through the deep snow. The town shrunk to a speck behind them, its church steeple barely visible through the skeletal trees. The wind howled through the forest, but it could not drown out the sounds which haunted their memories. They stopped for a moment where they held each other's hands to warm them, though it wasn't all that cold out. "We have to keep moving," Sean urged. Fritz nodded, but his eyes drifted back toward the direction they came from. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a long moment, snowflakes clinging to his dark lashes, his breath curling in the frigid air. Sean knew what he was thinking. It was the only home he ever knew, the place where he was raised, where he once believed he would spend the rest of his life. No matter how cruel it had been, no matter how much it suffocated him, leaving it behind felt like tearing away a huge piece of himself. Sean gently touched his shoulder. Fritz swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll ever change?" Sean followed his gaze behind them. "No." Fritz closed his eyes for a moment, his breath shuddering. Then slowly he turned. Sean reached for his hand. Fritz took it. Together they pressed forward into the wilderness, the snow swallowing their footprints behind them. The growls of the groundhog faded into the distance. The lanterns of Punxsutawney disappeared into the falling dusk. And for the first time, they walked toward a future unbound by fear,